I don't know about you, but I am a fan of art museums. I have enjoyed visiting them for as long as I can remember. And growing up in Northeast Ohio, I would often visit the Cleveland Museum of Art, which is a spectacular museum. And it gave me a real passion to see art in person whenever I have the opportunity. Even to this day, anytime that I visit a major city or that I'm out traveling, I seek out wherever notable art is being displayed to go and visit it. I have spent hours or days even just taking in the imaginations of creators throughout the world. And I enjoy so much seeing someone else's artistic perspective because somehow it refreshes me. It inspires me. It points me to God in a way that art uniquely does. I'm particularly a fan of a certain style of art, though. It's a period of art that consists of realistically styled paintings that were painted from 1830 to the late 1800s. Now that's pretty specific, but it's art surrounding the pre-Raphaelite period. And I love this style of art for a couple reasons. First, I love the brilliant colors that are used. I love that art style uses characters that are from literature and mythology and from religion. And I think the art in that time frame was particularly interesting because it was the first time in history where painters were in direct competition with the newly developed technology of photography. And of course, this was the time before color photography was available. So one of the advantages that paintings had over photographs in that era that artists liked to highlight were the colors that they used. Photographs were still in black and white, but the contrasts of colors in painting in that era are often intentionally spectacular. Obviously, though, photography generally presented a more accurate depiction of the subject, so a focus on realism became more important in paintings because painters started feeling pressure to compete with the photographs that were being presented to the populace. And as a result, painters really started using the medium to its fullest potential to show some of the benefits that paintings could have in comparison to photographs. And so, for example, there are certain paintings in that time period where the eyes of the subject in the art piece, they're just so captivating. You can just sit and admire them in perpetuity. They glisten and they show hope in a way that none of the photography did of that era. They're just phenomenal. And I've often just sat and looked at these paintings for hours. But even as I sit in those exhibits, gazing at the splendor of these marvelous creations, particularly the ones that are paintings of actual people who lived and breathed and walked on earth, I've often wondered if the painting that I'm observing does the subject justice. I mean, these were people who lived lives like you and I, and they worked, they had families, they had friends, they sang and danced, and they celebrated and they mourned. And so often I wonder if we were to go back in time in a time machine and meet the loved ones of the subjects in the painting, would they say that the painting of their loved one did that person justice? It's hard for me to think that they would. As much as I love those paintings, it's hard for me to think they would, and that's because no matter how good a painting is, it can't really encapsulate the wonder of who someone is fully. It's a glimpse, it's a fond memory, but it's only a tiny glimmer into who someone was. In 1 Corinthians 3:12, the Apostle Paul famously says, "For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known." When we look at art, I think we really do understand what Paul's saying as it pertains to a painting and its subject. And when it comes to ourselves, I think deep down we understand it even more. For instance, I don't even think that for most of us, when we look at who we are, like we look in a mirror, I don't even think we really know what we look like. This sounds a little strange, but here's what I mean. Have you ever gone to a store and you try on clothes and you go to one of those mirrors that they have, and they're usually like 3 mirrors. Sometimes they're the big ones. There's 6 mirrors. They wrap all around you, and they show you all the angles of yourself. Sometimes I look in those mirrors and I go, do I really look like that? And I think you know what I'm talking about, because this is the exact same thing that happens on social media. You might take 100 pictures of yourself, and only the top 10%, even of a really photogenic person, end up making it to the internet. And if you're like most people, it's more like 1% or less of your photos end up on the internet. Now, why is that? Well, mostly because we don't like how a lot of those photos make us look. We look at them and we think we look weird, or we look off somehow, or it doesn't show the best angle of us, whatever that means. And even after the digital camera was invented, people didn't like how they looked so much that social media went and invented filters so that you can radically alter the photo with like 25 default filters alone on Instagram, and there are more if you just want to swap some out. And even with all those filters, all those ways to manipulate how the photo looked, it also gives you the option to adjust the angle of the photo, the brightness, the contrast, the structure, the warmth, the saturation, the color, the fade, the highlights, the shadows, the vignette, the tilt shift, and to sharpen the image. And that's if you haven't already taken the image into Photoshop to begin with in order to add an exotic vacation destination in your background. And still, after doing all of that, we look at ourselves in those photos and we go, well, that's okay, I guess. And the funny thing about it is that the people who know us, they know what we look like already. We aren't fooling anyone. And you know what's ironic about all that? What I find ironic is no matter how much you alter those photos, they still don't do you justice. They don't do you justice. It doesn't, and here's what I mean by that. It doesn't matter if it's a painting or a sculpture or a photograph or even a video. None of those mediums can fully do a person justice. And we know this because if you've ever been to a funeral, none of those things console people who have lost a loved one. The person who is gone is far more special than any artistic medium that we have could possibly express. They mean more than our poetry and our songs. They mean more than our sculptures or our tributes. And that means that in a very real way, you are a priceless work of divine art. Have you ever thought about yourself that way? Now, on some level, that may seem obvious, but what we tend to forget is when Paul is saying, for now we see in a mirror dimly, now we know only in part, he isn't talking about the artistic representation of who we are, like a painting of us. He's talking about what we experience as the fullness of ourselves right now. He's saying this is what we see dimly, what we think is the totality right now. And so what he's saying is that you are magnificent now, but you don't even have the God filter on yet. People are so amazing already, and what we know of ourselves now is only something like what we will become. 1 John 3:2 says something similar when it says, what we will be has not been revealed. What we do know is that when God is revealed, we will be like him, for we will see him as he is. So reading this, there may be a day in the future when we look back on our current existence and view it like a painting or a photograph, because it won't express all that we have become. When I was a kid, there was a children's book that I really liked. It was called Flat Stanley. And if you've never read it, you should go pick it up. But the gist of the book is this. One night, a child named Stanley is sleeping in his bed, and a bulletin board falls on him while he's sleeping in bed. And the bulletin board doesn't kill Stanley. That'd be a pretty terrible children's book. It doesn't kill him, but instead it just squashes him flat. And so finding himself in this precarious position of being flat, Stanley decides to make the best of things. And he figures out that because of his new condition, he can slide under locked doors and get into places he couldn't normally. He convinces his brother to take him to the park and fly him like a kite. He mails himself in an envelope to some friends in California so he can visit them. At one point, he even disguises himself as a painting at an art museum to help apprehend some thieves. It's a great little book. He finds that being as he is pretty unique, and it's fun in many regards, being flat. But eventually, he becomes tired of his flatness, and his brother restores him to his proper shape by using a bicycle pump. Sometimes I think that our experience of life is like Stanley's in that story when he's flat. We don't necessarily dislike how we are now, and we know we're unique, but we also know that there's some other dimension of ourself that's missing. In the Gospels, Jesus gives us a glimpse of this new way of being to come in the form of the resurrection. But even to this day, we have a hard time getting our heads around what a resurrected version of ourselves might be like. I like what N.T. Wright says about this. He says, so what don't we know about our future state? Well, thinking about the resurrection or about God's whole new world in which our resurrection will take place is very difficult. We could say it's not quite like this or it's more like that. We know that because the present world is God's good creation, it will be like this, only more so, without corruption, decay, death, injustice, illness, sorrow, and shame. But what will we be like? Perhaps we should say, like we are, only much more so. More gloriously physical, not less. Embodied, but not subject to sickness and death. Able to celebrate the joy of God's world, but no longer lured or seduced into abusing them, into lusting after them, into worshiping them as though they were divine. You see, I think as human beings, if we're self-reflective, we know deep down that we don't really want to exploit people or the world because that just leaves us feeling empty. We don't want to constantly be enslaved to the idea that we constantly need to acquire more. What we want is to be fully us, whatever that means. We want to be restored to our proper shape. We aren't saying that there aren't things as we are to be admired in this present way of being, because we know that there are. We know that, like a good piece of art, our current existence inspires awe and wonder and imagination. But deep down, we also know all of the corruption, decay, death, injustice, illness, sorrow, and shame, they don't belong here either. And so as creatures made in the image of God, as God's children, as it declares in 1 John 3:2, it's our responsibility to do our very best to live into that more full version of ourselves. The good news is that this is exactly what Jesus came to show us how to do. It's exactly what he came to show us how to do. Christ came to show us how to be caretakers of the cosmos. Christ came to show us a path to redemption where these ills of the world no longer hold power over us, but fall away as we emerge into the newness of our future selves. And so, if you are struggling right now, or maybe life doesn't seem as picture perfect as you had hoped, or maybe things seem downright awful like they do at some time for all of us, I want to just encourage you to remember how artistically beautiful you've been made by God. I want you to just take a second and appreciate how magnificent a creation you are, and how magnificent. Look at how wonderful this world, this existence that we live in, even with all its flaws. Just observe that goodness for a moment. Just absorb it. And then realize that this is just the beginning. This is just the beginning. One day, with Christ's help, we are all going to help make all of that bad stuff dissipate. And while we can't even fully see it yet, there is a picturesque version of us and the cosmos that is coming into being on the horizon. So, brothers and sisters, take hope, because the great artist is at work and exponential beauty is on its way. In the name of the Creator and the Redeemer and the Holy Spirit. Amen.